Stalin, section. Conspiracy, infiltration of the state apparatus, and Aesopian language. The exiled revolutionary didn't renounce his plans. But how would he seek to carry them out? Malaparte writes, beginning of long quote, "The acts of sabotage on the railways, power stations, telephone, and telegraph lines increase every day. Everywhere Trotsky's agents worm their way in. Screwing with the gears of the state's technical organization, they provoke once in a while the partial paralyzation of sensitive agencies. They are the skirmishes that precede the insurrection." End quote. Is this a matter of mere illusions, or the echo of the regime's propaganda? The book cited here, after being published, circulated widely in Europe, and the thesis within it did not appear to provoke contemptuous smiles or scandalized laughter. Just like with terrorism, so we must not lose sight of the particular history of Russia when it comes to sabotage. In 1908, both the petroleum executives and Stalin repeatedly condemned, with obviously different motives, the certain tendencies within the working class to achieve their demands by resorting to, quote, economic terrorism. Despite stressing that the ultimate cause of this phenomenon was capitalist exploitation, the Bolshevik leader had welcomed, quote, the latest resolution by the strikers from Mirzoev factory, directed against the fires and economic assassinations, and against the old terroristic and anarchist tendencies, end quote. By the start of the 1930s, had this tradition totally disappeared, or did it continue to manifest in new forms? In any case, we saw the White Guards take advantage of it. What of the left opposition? The insurrectionary plans that Malaparte mentions reveals an important confirmation, at the very least. Here, Trotsky's biographer describes the attitude his hero continued to maintain while in exile. Quote, "The instructions are simple. The opposition must take on a solid military training, with a serious commitment to the party, and, once expelled from it, in the proletarian and Soviet organizations in general, referring always to the International." End quote. Here he turns against Soviet power the tradition of conspiracy, which greatly contributed to its establishment. In What Is to Be Done, Lenin especially emphasizes that we, the revolutionaries, quote, have to give maximum attention to propaganda and agitation among the soldiers and officers, and the creation of military organizations belonging to our party. End quote. Taking note of that lesson, the opposition organizes a clandestine network that gives particular attention to the military apparatus. The tortured process of its creation made the task of infiltrating it easier. What happened at the time the Cheka, the first political police force in Soviet Russia, was created is significant. On July 6, 1918, an attack takes the life of the German ambassador. The perpetrator was Yakov G. Blumkin, a socialist revolutionary who sought to protest the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and reopen the debate on it. When the chief of the Cheka, Felix E. Dzerzhinsky, went to the German embassy in Moscow to offer the apologies of the Soviet government, he is informed the authors of the attack appeared with the Cheka's credentials. To discover the truth, he proceeds to the headquarters of that institution, where he is then arrested by, quote, Cheka dissidents, themselves either members or close to the Revolutionary Socialist Party. Later freed by the Red Guard, Dzerzhinsky then purges the political police and orders the execution of those responsible for the conspiracy and the mutiny. In conclusion, the first victims of the, quote, purge are members of the Cheka, although they formed part of the opposition. The perpetrator of the attack managed to flee, but doesn't yet exit the scene. Quote, Trotsky publicly recognized toward the end of 1929 having received Blumkin as a guest, while still an agent of the intelligence services of the Red Army. Lev Sedov, son and colleague of Trotsky, sought to make it appear as something casual. However, a document archived in Stanford, quote, shows that the contact between Trotsky and Blumkin didn't come about by coincidence, but from an organized link within the USSR. In this content, quote, the secret agent evidently had an important role, end quote. It would be this link that pushes Stalin, quote, to order Blumkin's execution, end quote. As you can see, the opposition, quote, agents infiltrate everywhere. Even in the GPU, a small nucleus of Trotsky's loyalists remained hidden for a time. According to a contemporary American historian, it's possible that Genrikh G. Yagoda played a role as a double agent, the man who led the first phase of the Great Terror, before he is even consumed by it. According to the account of militant anti-Stalinists, it's known that, quote, some opposition documents were printed in the typography of the GPU, end quote. Looking closely, there's, quote, permanent tension within Russia's state terrorist apparatus, end quote. The infiltration is made easier by the regime's cautious opening. Upon calling for struggle against the bureaucratic dictatorship, Trotsky points out that, quote, the new constitution offers at the same time a semi-legal trench from with which to fight against it, end quote. It is best fought with camouflage, disguising their intentions of seeking to undermine and topple state power. On this point, the leader of the opposition leaves no room for doubt. Quote, the subversive work demands some conspiratorial precautions. It's necessary to observe in the struggle the rules of the conspiracy. Further, beginning of long quote, this life and death struggle can't be conceived without the cunning of war. In other words, without lies and deceptions. Could the German workers possibly avoid deceiving Hitler's police? Would Soviet Bolsheviks be unethical in deceiving the GPU? End of quote. Again, the Bolshevik conspiratorial tradition is turned against the regime that emerged out of the revolution. In 1920, Lenin had called for the revolutionaries' attention to, quote, the obligation of combining illegal forms of struggle with legal forms, with the obligatory participation in the most reactionary parliament and a certain number of other institutions under reactionary laws. End quote. And that's not all. Revolutionaries should know how to, quote, face all sacrifices and, in case of necessity, resort to all sorts of tricks and illegal methods, and to silence and to hide the truth with the objective of infiltrating the unions and remaining in them, and realizing there, at whatever cost, the work of a communist. End quote. It's exactly how the opposition conducts itself in relation to the political and social organizations of the hated Thermidorian regime. The conspirators follow a precise code of conduct. Beginning of long quote. Carry out self-criticism, recognize your errors, and that they are generally corrected. Those called two-faced men by the Stalinist press, or even the left-right faction, from this moment on seek contacts which would allow the broadening of the resistance front to Stalin's policies. Meet up with other groups on this path. End quote. It's understandable, then, the obsession over duplicity, the obsession for which Khrushchev condemned Stalin. Meanwhile, the abandonment of the NEP culminates in the rupture with Bukharin. Due to the position assumed by the latter, it's interesting to read the testimony of Herbert Drotz, leader of the Comintern, who was expelled from the Communist Party of Switzerland in 1942 over his differences with Stalin. On a trip to the first conference of the Revolutionary Labor Unions of Latin America in the spring of 1929, he meets with Bukharin and has a meeting with him, which he recalls in these words, quote, "He got me up to date on the contacts his group made with the Zinoviev-Kamenev faction to coordinate the struggle against Stalin's power," end quote. That he anticipated the struggle, including individual terrorism, whose central objective, quote, was eliminating Stalin, and to be clear, eliminate him physically, end quote. 3 years later, it is another representative of the right, Martemyan N. Ryutin, who draws up and circulates a document that passes from hand to hand, and which classifies Stalin as a provocateur, who they must rid themselves of, resorting even to tyrannicide. When Bukharin reveals his plans, Humbert Josse objects that, quote, "The introduction of individual terrorism in the political struggles born out of the Russian Revolution would run the risk of turning against those that used it," end quote. But Bukharin isn't persuaded. On the other hand, it would be difficult for the objection just seen to persuade a man who, as we now know, as he himself secretly revealed in 1936, harbored a profound hatred towards Stalin. In fact, the sort of absolute hatred that is reserved for a demon. While he expressed himself like this in private, Bukharin was in charge of Izvestia, the newspaper of the Soviet government. Are we dealing with obvious incoherence? Not from the point of view of the Bolshevik leader, who continued to combine legal and illegal work, with the aim of toppling a regime that he considered detestable, and who valued another of Lenin's lessons. In reference to Tsarist Russia, we can read in What is to be Done that, beginning of long quote, "In a country ruled by an autocracy, with a completely enslaved press, in a period of desperate political reaction in which even the tiniest outgrowth of political discontent and protest is persecuted, the theory of revolutionary Marxism suddenly forces its way into the censored literature, and, though expounded in Aesopian language, is understood by all interested parties." End quote. This is exactly how Bukharin uses the Soviet government's newspaper. The condemnation of the, quote, all-seeing total state, founded on blind discipline, Jesuit obedience, and on the, quote, glorification of the leader, pretends to alone make reference to Hitler's Germany, but in fact points to the USSR as well. The Aesopian language recommended by Lenin becomes immediately transparent when the denunciation refers to, quote, cruel and uncultured provincialism, end quote. It's clearly the portrait of Stalin painted by the opposition. We saw Trotsky refer to him as a, quote, small provincial man. And in discussions behind closed doors, it is Bukharin himself that expresses his disdain for the leader that has succeeded Lenin, despite not knowing any foreign languages. Continuing on the effectiveness displayed in Tsarist Russia by the revolutionary message expressed in Aesopian language, What is to be Done proceeds as follows. Beginning of long quote. Quite a considerable time elapsed, by our Russian standards, before the government realized what had happened, and the unwieldy army of censors and gendarmes discovered the new enemy and flung itself upon him. Meanwhile, Marxist books were published one after another. Marxist journals and newspapers were founded. Nearly everyone became a Marxist. Marxists were flattered, Marxists were courted, and the book publishers rejoiced at the extraordinary, ready sale of Marxist literature. End quote. Bukharin and the opposition hoped that a similar phenomenon would create a climate favorable to Stalin's overthrow. But Stalin also read What is to be Done, and knew the rules of Bolshevik conspiracy well. In conclusion, we witness a prolonged civil war. The clandestine network organizes itself, or seeks to reorganize itself despite successive rounds of repression that become increasingly unforgiving. According to the words of an active militant in the struggle against Stalin, quote, "Despite being stomped on and annihilated, the opposition survived and grew. In the army, in the administration, in the party, in the cities, in the rural areas, every terrorist wave, from Stalin's regime, brought forth a resistance movement." End quote. The leading Bolshevik group now appears divided in a conflict that doesn't exclude coups, and that, at least in the expectations and hopes of Stalin's enemies, from one moment to another could become open and generalized, involving the entire country. While the opposition turns to Lenin's lessons and to the conspiratorial tradition of Bolshevism to weave their plans in the shadow, this double game provokes the outrage of Soviet power, which identifies in false friends the most dangerous and insidious enemy. The tragedy heads towards its conclusion. End section.